Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a DJ and music producer, and he is the author of a pair of nonfiction books, The Quiet Storm and DJs Mean Business. His name is Amani Roberts, and my interview with Amani will follow the note-taking sounds. Amani Roberts, also known as DJ Amro, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Aaron. I'm happy to be here.
What do you love most about being a DJ and a music producer?
Yes. So the question was, repeat the question because I was laughing.
What do you love most about being a DJ and a music producer?
I love being able to move the crowd through music and getting their reaction seeing their reaction when they hear songs that take them back to a time in the past. I love kind of reading the room and seeing people's reactions.
You've written a couple of nonfiction books that are related to music, and your most recent one is titled The Quiet Storm, and it's a nonfiction book about R&B music. Without spoiling too much about The Quiet Storm, what is it about?
So it's about the history of R&B groups. I go through each decade starting in the 50s and highlight the top 10 or 11 R&B groups. We stop in the mid-2000s, which is very synonymous for when R&B groups kind of fell off the radar. And then after the review of all the groups, I then talk about what happened to them, why they disappear, and what could happen next.
How has the evolution of Black American music from gospel to blues to R&B to hip hop reflected the struggles and triumphs of Black American history?
I think that if you start with gospel music and the blues, which are kind of the originators of R&B music, they're kind of the roots. It's just I like to say like an underground history chronicling the trials and tribulations and success. Like I say, the book title, The Passion, Pain, and Power of R&B Groups of the People, of African-American people in this country. So it's kind of like a hidden but not so hidden timeline that walks you through what was going on per decade in terms of some specific artists that write about those kind of things.
Now, I should also mention to our listeners before I ask the next question, a lot of music genres that are or were popular in the United States at some point in history. A lot of them were originally developed by Black artists, even if some of them, like disco, for example, which was popular back in the 70s, it started out being performed by Black artists, but it had been co-opted by quite a diverse group of people.
Yes, disco is part of that category. Country music is part of that category. Rock music, even pop music. Like pretty much all those four main genres started from R&B.
What role did the groups and this is going to cover quite a bit of R&B history here, the Temptations, TLC, and Destiny's Child play in shaping Black identity and representation in mainstream American music?
The Temptations were one of the first groups to hit mainstream radio and just hit the mainstream in terms of their music, how much they sold, their concerts, Grammy nominations and wins. So they were probably one of the first groups to hit the mainstream. They were at the same time as the Supremes. And so they were kind of like the originators that really were on the backs and efforts of the groups in the 50s. So they brought R&B groups to the mainstream. Then you mentioned TLC. They're one of only two US-based groups in history to earn the diamond status in terms of 10 million units sold or more for an album. So they really kind of helped groups level up. Also, they took an incredible amount of creative risks, whether it was wearing condoms on their outfits, which was taboo at the time when they came out, whether it was singing about domestic abuse and AIDS. They're one of, I think, the only group, maybe one of two, to sing about AIDS and domestic abuse in a song and have that song go to #1 in the Billboard Hot 100 charts for Waterfalls. But then they also served as a cautionary tale because the group themselves didn't own their work, didn't own their name, so they had to claim bankruptcy twice. And so they're also used as a case study in the music industry on kind of how to make sure you protect your IP and you get your songwriting credits and you keep your publishing. So they have many, many lessons in terms of TLC. I could teach a whole class on TLC. And then Destiny's Child was pretty much the last major R&B group in the mainstream on Billboard Hot 100 charts that had success. After they all went solo, is really kind of accelerated the decline or the disappearance of R&B groups.
In what ways did R&B groups serve as a voice for social change and empowerment in America, particularly during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s and years after that?
Yeah, there were several groups that would release and sing songs about what was going on in the time periods that was really, really a lot of protests were going on, civil rights were going on. And so there were numerous groups, whether, and I'm trying to remember the specific groups, but like the Impressions released a song in 1964 called Keep On Pushing. They also released another song in 1964 called People Get Ready. And so these songs went to number 10 and number 14 in the charts. So people were hearing them, and those were like kind of anthems of the movement. Then you had Sly and the Family Stone, and we have to acknowledge, may Sly Stone rest in peace. He just passed away yesterday. They had a song in 1969 for Everyday People. So those are three songs from two groups that really spoke to the times that was going on in terms of protesting and the civil rights movement. Those are three songs that directly talked about that.
Even though this is actually fairly recent event and affected a genre that had been popular for several decades, why did and how has the music industry left R&B behind?
That is a question that needs to be answered. I think there was many things that happened. I think that as you look into the 90s, mid 90s, hip hop music went mainstream. And for some reason, which is a whole nother research project, record labels really chose to pursue and push hip hop music, but not R&B groups, which is a question, why couldn't they do both? I don't know the answer. Then you had EDM music got to be really popular, and for another reason, radio stations thought that that was a more palatable genre to put on radio than R&B and R&B groups. Then we have the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that was supposed to diversify radio. It ended up shifting radio across the country to a more playlisting format. Therefore, you could be in Seattle, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and you're going to hear generally the same songs, took away the local flavor. And that's how many R&B groups got to be known, as they would become very popular locally, like a TLC or a 112 in Atlanta, a Destiny's Child in Houston. You go to Boyz II Men coming from Philly, Shy coming from D.C., all these groups that were birthed locally and then grew nationally, that kind of took away some of that power. Then you had African American media that kind of went away. You had Ebony, Essence, Jet, Vibe magazine at their heyday had over 8,200,000 monthly subscribers. Those magazines either closed down and came back as digital, or their subscriber base declined. So when I did my research a year or two ago, they were down below a million monthly subscribers, and that's a substantial loss for R&B groups to have earned PR media. So those are some of the top highline reasons that are covered in the research portion of the book.
You've written another book, also a nonfiction book. It's titled DJs Mean Business. Without spoiling too much about that book, what is it about?
It takes you through the time slots of a DJ set from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. and each 15 minutes covers a point that would help you or relates to like growing a business. So for example, the 11 p.m. to 11:15 p.m. slot is about troubleshooting. When you're a DJ working in the club, something always goes wrong. It could be your computer issues, speaker goes out. There's always an issue. So how do you navigate the issue without stopping the music? Because the rule is that the music can never stop. In business, sometimes you have to make some shifts and change. Maybe you thought one product would be a big seller, but another product actually ends up being the big seller, or a different service comes to comes to the forefront as more successful. So you have to shift. You don't close down your business, but how do you shift and adjust to the needs of your clientele? So each 15 minutes, I cover like some sort of business lesson and how it relates to growing your career or your business.
What motivates you to write nonfiction books about music or music related topics?
That's a good question. I think for me, I think these are just stories that need to be told that haven't been told. And it comes from my perspective where I have a business background also as a, professional creative. So I'm able to share my experience and my stories. But like the Quiet Storm was just a history of R&B groups. It was my thesis in grad school, so I turned it into a book. And as I continue to write, just cover additional stories that haven't been told but are part of our culture and need to be told and need to kind of be in like put in like our libraries and have something that people can consistently refer back to over history, part of the legacy of our culture.
How long did it take you to write each of your books from start to finish?
So the first book, I think this first book took me about a year and a half to write. It took me a little longer to edit because the editing process kind of threw me off and kind of got to my ego. So that took me a little longer. This next book, The Quiet Storm, that took me about 4.5 years. It took me about 2 years to do all the research, and then another 2 years to kind of do more interviews, write the book, get the photos, do the editing. So all in all, this one took me about 4.5 years to write.
What are the easiest and hardest aspects of writing nonfiction books for you? And what did you learn about nonfiction book writing while writing your first book that you were able to apply to your second book?
Okay, three strong questions there. So I'll say, oh, the easiest thing about writing a book is coming up with the idea and the outline. That's just the easiest part right there. That's what many people can do. I think the hardest part that I experienced many times is finishing the book. Specifically, you kind of have to finish the book like 3 times. If your first final manuscript is one time, then your first edit would be a second time, and then your final edit would be a third time. It's extremely hard to finish a book. I think the stats go from the New York Times did a survey, like 81% of the people in the United States have a book inside of them. 4% of that 81% will start the book, and then 4% of that 4% will finish. So if you just say there's a room of 300 people, 242 people will have a book inside of them, then you'll have probably about 11 people will start to write the book, and maybe one person will finish. Maybe one person. In terms of what I learned compared the first time writing a book to the second time, is to not take personal offense to the edits. When I first wrote my first book, yeah, I got the edits back. She had cut the book down by about 18,000 words, and I was just taken aback, and I let my ego get in the way. And so it delayed my book release for 4 or 5 months. So instead of a book coming out in November 2019, it came out April 2020 in the middle of the pandemic, which just really prevented me from promoting it and going on tour. So I learned that in the second book, don't take it personal. Don't let your ego get involved. Just trust the editors, and apply what they're suggesting to your edits. Also, I recommend getting an editor that you don't know. So they're unbiased, they can tell you the truth and not have any worries about offending you. I also learned about the entire book release process for the second book, just bulk orders, booking, speaking obligations, and including books, how to do single offers. If someone wants to buy my book, what can I give them in advance? And then promoting the book consistently. I learned so much this second release that I'm still learning.
Are both of your books independently, traditionally, or hybrid published, or did you use different publishing methods for each of your books?
It's like hybrid publishing. So I still own the IP and I work with a couple companies, book launchers to help me release the book, but I still own the IP, and then Brand Builders Group to help me with distribution and strategy and planning. So I still own the IP, but I had a lot of help with all the mechanics of releasing a book because it's very difficult to do all that, release a book, have it reach number 50 on the USA Today's bestseller list on week one, and stay sane. So it's very, very difficult. So I had lots of resources helping me.
Until 2021, you hosted the Amani Experience Podcast, although episodes of the podcast are still available to listen to online. What was it like to host your own podcast, and what topics did your podcast focus on?
Um, that was a podcast that I started way back in the day. And I think it was like my second kind of version of a podcast, but first where it was like strictly interviewing. So I learned about just kind of promoting it, completing the interview process, doing all those things. And I had paused it kind of during pandemic because I was just too overwhelmed with other things. Now I have another podcast I do with my co-host, Manny Graziano, called Adventures in Business Live. And we've been doing that one since July of 2022. So I still podcast. I just have a partner now. And that's how we roll. And I love podcasting. I think it's a great networking tool. It's great for content. And it just kind of it's excellent for thought leadership.
Okay, before I finish this interview, again, could you repeat what the podcast you co-host now is, and what topics does that cover?
So that podcast is Adventures in Business, and we talk to kind of C-suite entrepreneurs, primarily in the hospitality, events, speakers space, and we kind of talk about how they've grown their companies, what challenges that they face, and advice they have for people who want to follow in their footsteps. And that one is once a week. We broadcast it live, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. on the West, on like LinkedIn and YouTube.
Amani, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an insightful guest to interview.
Thank you very much for having me, Aaron. I appreciate the opportunity to share my wisdom.
It was fascinating to interview Amani about his work as an author, podcaster, DJ, and music producer. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.